I have been in love with attachment theory since the day I learned about it. I really have. And while it's not a perfect theory, I think that for me, it helps me understand where people have their core wounds so much of the time. So here's a little series we're going to start out talking about what attachment looks like in the classic dynamics around secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, often called a few other things, which I'll get to. And in today's video, we're going to talk about anxious attachment because I want you to really get the gist of it. But what I want to say is this: it's so important to understand that too many people, I think, pop psych this theory and really start to just demonize or kind of label these certain types of patterns without understanding the deep nuances about what creates an attachment pattern. And I want to use the word pattern more so than style, because I think we have a general pattern we kind of like lean into. But we have to understand that other people, secondary and tertiary, third types of attachment human beings like teachers and siblings and grandparents and aunts and uncles, all of these things, bullies in social situations, can have a real impact on creating what is often attachment trauma that shapes the story of our lives. And so we're going to start out talking about anxious. And I want you to think of it in this regard. Number one, I like the idea of using the colors dynamic, which is basically a kind of a way of looking at attachment through the lens, which I first heard about on a podcast called Therapist Uncensored. I highly recommend it. But this idea of thinking of ourselves in terms of colors, patterns of colors, which helps us depathologize attachment. And another part I'm working on in a course I'm creating on creating your own attachment manual to fully understand yourself so that you know what your triggers are, what your body does, how to deal with your hypervigilance, your nervous system, your core beliefs and wounds, is that you understand that human beings are complex. And so you may have in your very same one parent, they may have some patterns of avoidance and some patterns of anxiety, some parts of them that you feel good and close to, and parts that were really hurtful. And so it can make it difficult to just say, well, I'm only avoidant because of this. But what about the part of them that was actually sometimes, present or available? So the reason why I like this is that it's too simple to just say, well, you're only this style. And so I like to think about it as us having a general style, but to really embrace that we can have different parts of ourselves and that can lean into other styles. So let's get into the anxious style first. If you're new here, also, I'm a licensed psychologist, and this channel is all about attachment and trauma and relationships at its core. So when we think about the anxious, often called preoccupied attachment style, what we're really talking about are two main dynamics at the core. The underlying primary caregiving behaviors are about inconsistency, consistent inconsistency, a lack of predictability, and I'll explain that in a second, and over-involvement in the parent's state of mind for the child. So what this means basically is that these parents were sometimes there, sometimes not there, sometimes available emotionally, sometimes not. They were often kind of struggling with their own anxieties, a lot of their own fears at times in terms of being a parent, let's say, or managing life as caregivers. And as a result of their own anxieties and fears, a lot of this often spills over into the child's experience, the child's state of mind. And so what happens is these kids become often compulsive caretakers, what I've called and what they call from Dan Brown and David Elliott's book, outside-in orientators, that we look first to the parents because we've been overexposed, we don't know what to expect, it varies, we become, there's a motivation for becoming hypervigilant and degrees of hypervigilance depending upon how much they might swing. For example, sort of anxious to let's say an untreated parent with some kind of disorder that made them really emotionally unpredictable, where they were ragey or not ragey, things like that. But the bottom line is we learn to overread others, to respond to their needs, to sort of at times we can be enmeshed or parentified. That's that overexposure to the parent's state of mind. Or it's just that the parents didn't necessarily manage their own anxiety well at times. And so the kids really pick up on that. Kids really are, I believe this with all of my core, first of all, less resilient than we think they are, because they just don't show the same symptoms sometimes. I think that they struggle and it comes out later in life in a therapist's office. They seemed fine. But we also just don't really understand that they are reading us all of the time. I've told patients this a million times. You can look at your kids and say, Mommy's fine, I'm fine, when you're like falling apart inside. And of course that's a dramatic way to say it, but the point is they know. And so when this happens again and again and again, they learn to say, oh, it's sort of normal to have what my body feels. My body feels mommy or daddy or parent is upset, but they're saying they're not. Or it's normal to have a parent be upset about everything all of the time and then, seem fine when they're drinking later. So I learned that some things are okay and some things aren't, and sometimes they're fine and sometimes they're not. It's just really complicated. But the research says that this pattern is the outcome of a prolonged pattern of inconsistency of responsiveness. So that's the responsiveness. Remember, sensitivity to how much responsiveness a parent has or doesn't have. That is the core of attachment in part. And so this is an inconsistency of responsiveness and an over-involvement in the caregiver's state of mind, like I said. So this produces hyperactivation in the infant. So that's what I was saying, is where you learn I need to kind of hyperactivate, lean in, get close, meet their needs, help them with their own feelings, whatever it is, as opposed to deactivation we'll talk about in the more avoidant pattern. So they become really vigilant. The child becomes really aware about any possible signs of neglect, of rejection or abandonment, and they're looking for reassurance. Just like in childhood, they do the same thing in their adult lives. So because of this inconsistent pattern, they're sort of always scanning for any signs that you're going to leave them, cheat on them, not be in the relationship, overanalyze text messages, emojis, as I've talked about, all of the things. And the thing is that it's often rooted in this parental anxiety and inconsistency, which can play out in things like over control. And so the reason why that matters is that we know that kids who are, ironically, the more secure they are, the more stable and consistent the caregivers, generally speaking, so not perfectly, like up to 70% is the greatest, that would be the best case scenario, that we are more likely to go explore our environments when we feel secure. So if we're thinking about human beings, when a baby in the research is more secure with mommy in the strange situation, that baby is more likely to go explore the new toys they've never seen before, while mommy is sitting there knowing that mommy will be there. Whereas babies who entered the strange situation, for example, which is the famous study a lot of this is based on, and there are other studies as well, but this is what I'm talking about, is that the kids who were anxious, they never fully explored the room with the same, interest and autonomy and exploration as the kids who were more secure. And so basically they're clinging more, right? They've already learned they need to cling more. Now this also doesn't take into account kids have different temperaments and genetics and disorders that are underlying. There's a lot of reasons why these things could happen. So I'm just really trying to act like is no perfect world, but we're talking about the caregiver degree of responsiveness or not being the primary determiner and the exposure to the parent's state of mind of this style, okay? So what we know is that these are people who had this need to, stay closer and cling. And parents who have this style tend to have more issues with control. They tend to be a little more over-controlling. And if you think about why, it's because oftentimes when we have anxiety or our own fears, which these parents were pretty good at managing fear in terms of not managing fear. They were good at parenting with fear, right? So it can become like a glue, oh, don't touch that. And I feel really good. I'm keeping my child safe. You can't go outside. You have to have your helmet on. And that creates this thing where the baby's oh, well, this fear thing is a way for us to be closer in some regards. You feel confident then, I feel closer to you then, you cling to me then. And it can take on its own life. But basically, we know that these kids are going to have a little more anxiety because they were more likely to be over-controlled by their own parents in terms of things like safety and anxiety and things like that. So that becomes its own sort of thing. And so In an adulthood, these are people who often become more preoccupied with past hurts with respect to attachment-related memories and emotions. They tend to ruminate, so they tend to go back and rethink and re-worry and re-feel old hurts. And they tend to engage in primarily emotion-focused coping strategies. So they're leading with their emotions more than anything else, right? They have strong emotional reactivity and pervasively negative moods at times, which I think is really oftentimes about the hypervigilance. If you're scanning for rejection, neglect, all those things, then you're going to be more likely to be in a negative, it requires a more negative assessment of the environment. They tend to have a lesser developed sense of self, a little more less differentiated self-structure, and in general, I think part of the dynamic is that these hyperactivation strategies, they start to use those a lot in adult relationships to manage their own anxiety, which can look like control, clinging, trying to merge together, which for some partners might be actually not workable. That might be threatening. So we're really talking about parenting behaviors that set up a dynamic where we're always trying to figure out where we stand in the relationship, in the moment, in the mood, at any given time, and almost everything can be a threat. And we know that oftentimes we see compulsive caretaking and people pleasing as a way that these kids over focus on the parent's state of mind. And so then that plays out in, number one, helping other people get their needs met and neglecting your own and not knowing how you feel inside, and also feeling depleted but not necessarily having validation for that, or fatigued because you're so hyper-focused on others. And then really numbing your own pain. If I'm so focused on you and trying to recreate that safety in childhood and get my needs met, that I'm really often just completely disregarding my own wounds about the needs I did not get met in childhood. So just a few more things that the research shows. They tend to be more occupied with traumatic memories and experiences. They often have a lot of entangled, complicated relationships. They can have an excessive need for reassurance and a limited capacity for self-soothing. Often experience love as an obsession, desiring reciprocity and union, but really having a lot of extreme highs and lows, extreme levels of attraction or not, extreme levels of jealousy. They often tend to overly rely on partners for their sense of self and detect threat in every situation, like I was saying. And so we have a lot of rethinking things and rumination and hypervigilance. And so all of that, you can see why that dynamic can play out in adulthood if a lot of these lower key versions of this was happening in childhood, right? Trying to read, detect the parents, and manage the overexposure to state of mind, and having all those feelings in your own body, but not knowing what to do with them. And to be really seeking the other. That's the thing. They are leaning toward and going in. And one of the strengths about this style is that they do want to solve problems. They do want to talk about things. They do want to work it out. So they're going to be really good at that. And their caregiving skills can be beautiful and loving. And there's a lot of really wonderful qualities. And they pay attention to things. They might overpay attention, and that can be a challenge. And they need to work on how to create their own sense of reassurance and things like that. But don't forget that there are also these beautiful qualities around your attentiveness that can actually make you a really beautiful, loving partner and a really safe partner, because you're so aware of not doing things that can be detrimental, that can be a really good thing as long as it's not going to the extreme end. It really can show a dedication and a passion to being a good partner and a loving and safe partner yourself. So that is it for the anxious style. I will see you tomorrow. We'll talk more about the different patterns and attachment patterns, and I hope you will consider subscribing, and I will see you soon. Take care. Have a good day.